Shabbat Shalom. All right, you get to play the English teacher for a couple minutes. I am going to make a few statements, and I want you to correct me. I wish Mark Kluger was here. He always looks for that back and forth of correcting each other. Okay, let's see if I can do this. It's hard sometimes to forcibly break the rules. So, we are now into the holiday season. And that means if you had the misfortune of going to any of the shopping malls, you may have seen that many of them have there in the middle of the room raised a tree. What's the word? Raised a tree, right? They didn't rise a tree, they raised a tree. Rise, raise, aren't they the same thing? We're going up. Okay, hold on. Well, but what they'll often do as well is around the store, they will sit different displays and decorations. Set different displays and but sit and set, I mean, it's the same thing. You're just on a surface, right? Okay, well, what I've also noticed is that sometimes they will lie out like an entire like greenery or snow. All right, what in the world is the difference between rise and raise, sit and set, and lie and lay? But I can certainly lay my baby to sleep. And I can certainly set my baby in the high chair. But I sit in my chair. Ooh, so close. We got a number of red herrings in that, but it involves a person having to perform. Yes, there is a fancy word for this.
So there's a congregation in the church and a synagogue that uses something else. And then raise is something that is used in like raising a tree.
Mm-hmm. See, if you were all native-born English speakers, you'd first of all be really frustrated trying to learn English. But you would all immediately be able to tell this, because this is the difference in Hebrew that is reflected in what is known as the binyan, the structure of grammar. Because what we are noticing in these three very few examples in English is that there are causative forms of verbs. Yeah, I know. You probably never learned that in your grammar class back in elementary school, if you even had a grammar class in elementary school, because that's been cut to balance the budget. All right, what is a causative verb? A causative verb is a verb where the action comes from one source and causes something to happen to the other thing. Right? When I stand up, I rise, because I am doing that myself. When I make a tree rise, I raise it. Raise is the causative form of rise. I am making it go up. Same thing with sit and set. When I go back to my chair, I will sit down. But if I put something in my chair, I will set it down. I am causing it to sit. I have set it in the chair. And the same with lie and lay. Everybody with me so far? Now, this would be so much easier if we were just doing this in Hebrew, because in Hebrew it is literally baked into the grammar. Almost every verb has a causative form, even if it doesn't get used all that much. So let me give you a quick example of the elegance of Hebrew that gets lost in Hebrew. What is the Hebrew verb for writing? Kotev, right? In the present tense form, kotev. In the past tense, katav. It's how Hebrew plays with vowels for doing their conjugation. Excellent. Now, if I wanted to turn that into the causative form, I would keep my three root letters, the kaf, the tet, the tav, and the vet, and then I would put them into what's called the hif'il form. The hif'il, lehachtiv, lehachtiv, which in English you could say, he caused someone else to write. Little clunky in English. You know what? In English, let's just make it hard for foreigners and come up with a whole other word, dictate. That's what English does. English usually doesn't bother creating a causative form of a verb. It just either slaps together a whole bunch of words, he caused the other person to write, or he made the other person write down what he said, or you come up with an entirely unrelated word that we just pretend is somehow the causative version, dictate. Whereas lehachtiv, you can hear it has that same kaf, taf, and vet built into the same root. And reading it especially, it is brilliantly obvious that what's happening on the page is a causative action. I geek out about language. You all should know that by now. Okay, now that I've got the foundation, let's get into some fun examples. If I am king, what root would I use? Melech, right? Melech, right? Adonai, Melech, Adonai. God was king, Adonai. God will be king. Very good. If God wants to make somebody king, that would be lehamlich. Notice, mem, lamed, chaf, still in the same configuration. We just changed the vowels and put in a little hey at the beginning for the infinitive form. Lehamlich. He caused that person to be king. Or as in English, we would say, crowned. Again, totally unrelated word that we had to make up from the hat because English doesn't do causative very well. Whereas Hebrew, perfectly elegant, lehamlich. I have caused that to be king. What is the Hebrew word for something that is holy? Kadosh, right? Kodesh, all of these wonderful words. And if I wanted to make something holy, lehakdish. Lehakdish. Now you're maybe getting the pattern here a little bit, that ah-e sort of voweling that's coming up more and more often. Notice that when we go through our tefillot, because you're going to find it in many, many parts of our prayers. This causative form is very common because, well, we're often hoping that God will cause things to happen. Right? We would hope that God will do things, that God will make things happen, and therefore we often use this causative form, this hifil binyan, this hifil structure of Hebrew grammar. Now, if you're not completely sick and tired of this yet, we need to get into the actual meat of the sermon. Because I'm not just here to teach you a little bit of Hebrew grammar. I'm here to teach you how Hebrew grammar can actually be theologically profound in a way that, I'm sorry, English cannot keep up with. At least no English translation that I've ever come across. So, I just said, lehakdish is a perfectly reasonable causative form. If I were to dedicate a cow to be a sacrifice, I would be sanctifying it. I would be causing it to become holy. Great. Again, sanctify, holy, totally different words because English can't keep up. But you will notice, because I'm drawing your attention to it, that when we go through certain parts of our prayers, sometimes we're the group that are lehakdishing, to really mangle two languages, God. We are the ones, hamakdishim. We are the ones that are causing God's name to be sanctified. Now, it's very important that we translate it like that, unlike every other siddur that I've ever seen, because if we don't, we lose sight of what's actually being intended by the prayer. We're not declaring that God's name is holy, like, yep, God told me his name is holy, and I'm going to agree that God's name is holy. That is an entirely different verb. We are the source of the sanctification to God. Without us, God would not be sanctified. Without us, God would not be holy. We caused it to happen. Just like someone raising the tree, we cause the holiness to become attached to God. Now, why is that theologically profound or a head-scratcher, depending upon where you are? No. Before that, I mean, this is incredibly chutzpahdik, isn't it? Right?
Well, I think it's saying that it wasn't intrinsically
Very good. It's not intrinsically holy. We made it holy, and we just said that about God. I'm sorry, what? God's not intrinsically holy? Well, to go back to my Philosophy 101 class, and probably the parody that everybody knows about philosophy, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one around, does it make any sound? Right? Stupid question, but it actually is trying to teach you something that is profound. Does something matter if it is unobserved? God is holy. Of course God is holy. But what do we mean when we say God is holy? What does it matter that God is holy if nobody notices? If nobody notices God, if no one notices God's sanctity, does it matter? Or is God just like, some planet out in the universe that we've never even encountered or come into understanding of? It has no impact upon my life that I can discern. Of course, we know fundamentally, yes, God is the source of all of the universe. God is behind each and every aspect of reality. Of course, God has an impact on my life whether I know it or not, obviously. But that's not what God wants. That's not what God expects us to know on our own. It expects us to learn that, and then having learned it, to proclaim that it is true, and having proclaimed that it is true, we are in fact creating the appearance, the presence, the perceptibility of God's holiness in this world. We cause the holiness of God to be a tangible part of this world in a way that God could not by God's self. Our actions, our declarations, transform the potentiality of God's intrinsic holiness into the reality of reality-changing understanding. Because holiness is always something that is understood in relationship to other things, to that which is not holy in particular. And if we do not observe that God is holy, if we do not recognize that God is holy, then what good is God's holiness? It takes us to cause that holiness to matter. So, Hamakdishim, we are the ones that cause that holiness to be holy, and that's a fairly special job. Everybody with me so far? Because I know it got really complicated there in the middle. All right? We cause God's holiness to move from being the transcendent, the ethereal, the beyond the scope of our human understanding and perceptibility, to be known, awakened, to be seen in this world, to be understood, and to have an impact that's noticed, not an impact that's in secret, hidden behind the veil of divine secrecy, but there, present in the world, making it holy compared to all other things in the world. Let's try case number 2. If you think you've got Hamakdishim, that we are the ones that cause God's name to, or cause God to be holy, what do we do with Hamyachadim? Hamyachadim. We're going to say this in the Kedusha in just a couple minutes, well, give or take my sermon length. Hamyachadim. Well, first of all, we got to pull out the root. Hamyachadim. Yachad, which is the root for, that would be yad. I've got a chet there in the middle. Echad, exactly, right. Go with your gut. If it sounds similar in Hebrew, it probably is. Right? Echad. It comes from the word echad. All right, so now my little grammarians, what would the causative form of the word for one mean? Just work it out in English. We make one. We make something one. We make something one. We make whole. We are the ones that proclaim and cause God's oneness. All right, that's what the prayer is trying to tell us. Again, I can understand why the translators don't put that into the English because it's a big clunky phrase. We are the ones. We have that responsibility. It is on our shoulders to make God one. Hamyachadim. We are the ones that make God one. We are the nation, the people that make God one. Okay? Now that we've translated it, let's try and understand it. So, is God not one until we say God is? Right? It's like God multiplicities, and then we slam them together into being a single unit? No. Like holiness, God is one. That's intrinsic. That is essential to God. In fact, it is essential to God in a way that it is not for anything else in all of reality. Right? There may be only one Joshua in this room, but that's not like an actual requirement of reality. That's just an accident that no one else here happens to have that name, to the best of my knowledge. But there is one God that is what it is to be God. There isn't an option for a second God, because if there were two of the things you're calling God, then neither of them are God. Because to be God is to be one to the exclusion of all other competition. Now, if God is one even without us, then why do we think that we are causing God to be one? In what possible arena is that taking place? Right, we can't change God. If we didn't do our job, God would still be one. But like the case of holiness, who would know? Who would care? What would it matter? Yes, we cause God to be one, not in changing of God's essence. God's essence is always immutable. God will be one from the beginning until the end of time and beyond at both sides. But this world doesn't always get that message. This world doesn't always understand that. This world often will act as though God were not one, as though there was one God for the Christians and one God for the Muslims and one God for the Hindus and one God for every other group of the earth, or in more than one God perhaps. Even those that claim they have only one God may argue that their God is different than the other group that claims they have one God. And Judaism comes along and says, no, we're going to make one out of all of this. We are going to make God one. We are going to argue with all of you that there is only one God and that that God is a singular unified entity and that that God is the same for you, for me, from the beginning of time to the end of time, for the plants, for the trees, from viruses to galaxies, that this is all one God. And we're going to fight tooth and nail to make that happen. Am Yachadim. We are the nation that makes God one. But we don't do it just by saying it in the Kedusha and other parts of our prayers. We have to actually act like we believe that. And that's the part where it gets hard. I know, grammar sounds hard, doesn't it? All of the causative verbs and binyanim and all of this stuff that I keep throwing around and, this causes that. And it sounds fancy, and the philosophical God's oneness is essential to God's nature, unlike the accidental property for the rest of us. It sounds really good and complicated, and I'm sure I could have gotten a job, as a PhD somewhere rambling in front of undergrads. But the hard part, the real hard part, is actually living with that as your understanding of how you are supposed to live, of the actions you are supposed to take. That when you act, you should act in a way that declares God's oneness to all that observe. When you interact with someone else, when you treat them, are you treating them as though you recognize in them that they too are from the same one God? Or are you looking at them and thinking, they're someone else? Or God forbid, they're something else? Is it just a transactional relationship? Are you just treating them as though they are part of the background? Are you using them up as some object to be exploited to get what you need? Through the line at the checkout, fix my heating system. Well, air conditioner really more often in Orlando. Install this for me. Fix the car. My neighbor needs to move his truck. Are you treating them like they come from the same God? Are you treating them like they are a reflection, a mere refraction through the prism of reality of the singular unity of God? Or are you treating them as though they are fundamentally different than you? Can you look at even just a member of your own family and recognize in them the oneness of God and treat them with that profound worship and reverence that they, as another member of this unified aspect of God, deserve. If you can do that with your family, can you do it with your friends? Can you look at your friends and say, yes, I know they're sometimes a bit of a pain in the tuchus. Sometimes they annoy me. Sometimes I'm tired and don't really want to answer their call for help when they need something. Can you get past that and say, look, who am I denying? Am I saying, you know what? My left hand sometimes itches. Therefore, my right hand is going to smack it for daring to bother me. It's the same thing. It is all one. How can you treat someone like that and think that you are treating something different than yourself? And if you can manage that with your friends, can you manage it with your coworkers? Can you manage it with your neighbors, the members of your community, the stranger on the street or in the store? Can you manage it with the people you get so agitated about, that are so wrong on the internet, or on the TV show, or on the newscast, across the world? Can you even recognize, as much as we may still continue to need to be vigilant and strong, that even our enemies are still from the same God? They are still a reflection of that echad, that holy singularity of divinity. Again, that doesn't mean that we just throw down our weapons and say, whatever. But it does mean that when we look at them, even in the needs of war, that we don't stop understanding that they are, too, a reflection of that singular God. And that our job as Jews is to proclaim that singularity. It doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean being hippy-dippy and all of that other scurrilous forms of attack that are on the idea of seeing the unity of all things. But it does mean even as we do what must be done, we recognize the pain that we are doing it to a reflection of the same God that is found within us. It is all right to make difficult decisions. It is not all right to not cry over them. It is all right to take a life to save your own. It is not all right to not weep that it was necessary. Because taking another life is taking a part of ourselves. It is diminishing the glory of God in this world, the potential of what that life could have been, should have been, if only it had been better cared for, better reared, given a better opportunity. Again, the deed must be done, but we should weep that it needed to be done. We are Am HaMyachadim. We are the nation that proclaim the oneness of God. In all that we do, this must be reflected. From holding our child to holding a rifle. From dealing with the mundane trivialities of the workplace to dealing with the most profound questions of life and death for our own families. God is one in all and everything, in each of us in this room and in each of the 8 billion lives around this planet. That's the hard part. Grammar is easy. Philosophy is easy. Living a life that reflects the oneness of all, that reflects the oneness of God, that's the challenge. Shabbat Shalom.